Braddock looked on him with a gaze of scorn and spoke to him in a way that roused the ire of Captain Jack. He told his men what had been said, and the whole band turned their backs on the camp and went through the woods to their old haunts, where they were known and prized at their true worth. In the meantime, Washington, who had had a headache for some days, grew so ill that he could not ride on his horse, and had to be borne part of the time in a cart. Braddock, who knew well what a loss his death would be, said that he should not go on. Washington pleaded with him, but Braddock was firm and made him halt on the road. Here he was left with a guard and in the care of Dr. Craik, and here he had to stay for 2 long weeks. By that time he could move, but not without much pain, for he was still quite weak. It was his wish to join the troops in time for the great blow, and while yet too weak to mount his horse, he set off with his guards in a close cart, and reached Braddock's camp on the 8th of July. He was just in time, for the troops were to move on Fort Duquesne the next day. The fort was on the same side of the Monongahela as the camp, but twixt them lay a pass 2 miles in length, with the stream on the left and a high range of hills on the right. The plan was to ford the stream near the camp, march on the west bank of the stream for 5 miles or so, then cross to the east side and push on to the fort. By sunrise the next day, the troops turned out in fine style and marched off to the noise of the drum and fife. To Washington this was a great sight. Though still weak and ill, he rode his horse and took his place on the staff as aide-de-camp. At 1 o'clock, the whole force had crossed the ford north of the fort and were on their way up the bank, when they were met by a fierce and sharp fire from foes they could not see. Wild war whoops and fierce yells rent the air. What Washington feared had come to pass. Braddock did his best to keep the troops in line, but as fast as they moved up, they were cut down by foes screened by rocks and trees. Now and then one of the red men would dart out of the woods with a wild yell to scalp a redcoat who had been shot down. Wild fear seized Braddock's men, who fired and took no aim. Those in the front rank were killed by those in the rear. Some of the Virginia troops took post back of trees and fought as the red men did. Washington thought it would be a good plan for Braddock's men to do the same, but he thought there was but one way for troops to fight, and that brave men ought not to skulk in that way. When some of them took to the trees, Braddock stormed at them and called them hard names and struck them with the flat of his sword. All day long Washington rode here and there in the midst of the fight. He was in all parts of the field, a fine mark for the guns of the foe, and yet not a shot struck him to do him harm. 4 small shots went through his coat. 2 of his steeds were shot down, and though those who stood near him fell dead at his side, Washington had not one wound. The fight raged on. Death swept through the ranks of the redcoats. The men at the guns were seized with fright. Washington sprang from his horse, wheeled a brass field piece with his own hand, and sent a good shot through the woods. But this act did not bring the men back to their guns. Braddock was on the field the whole day and did his best to turn the tide, but most of his headmen had been slain in his sight. 5 times he had been forced to mount a fresh horse, as one by one was struck down by the foeman's shot, and still he kept his ground and tried to check the flight of his men. At last a shot struck him in the right arm and went into his lungs. He fell from his horse and was borne from the field. The troops took fright at once, and most of them fled. The yells of the red men still rang in their ears. "All is lost," they cried. "Braddock is killed." Washington had been sent to a camp 40 miles off and was on his way back when he heard the sad news. But Braddock did not die at once. He was brought back to camp, and for 2 days lay in a calm state but full of pain. Now and then his lips would move, and he was heard to say, "Who would have thought it? We shall know how to deal with them the next time." He died at Fort Necessity on the night of July 13th. Had he done as Washington told him, he might have saved his own life and won the day. But he was a proud man, and when he made up his mind to do a thing, he would do it at all risks. Through this fault he missed the fame he hoped to win, lost his life, and found a grave in a strange land. His loss was a great gain to Washington, for all felt that he, so calm, so grave, so free from fear, was the right sort of man to lead troops to war. Those who had seen him in the field thought that he bore a charmed life. For though he stood where the shot fell thick and fast, he was not hurt and showed no signs of fear. But Washington was weak and in need of rest. And as the death of Braddock left him with no place in the force, he went back to Mount Vernon, where he thought to spend the rest of his days. The fight which he took part in as aide-de-camp, and which had so sad an end, goes by the name of Braddock's defeat. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 6. Colonel of Virginia Troops. The troops in Virginia were left without a head. There was no one to lead them out to war, and if this fact came to the ears of the French, they would be more bold. Washington's friends urged him to ask for the place, but this would not do. His brother wrote him thus: "Our hopes rest on you, dear George. You are the man for the place. All are loud in your praise." But Washington was firm. He wrote back and told in plain words all that he had borne, and how he had been served for the past 2 years. "I love my land," he said, "and shall be glad to serve it, but not on the same terms that I have done so." His mother begged him not to risk his life in these wars. He wrote her that he should do all that he could to keep out of harm's way, but if he should have a call to drive the foes from the land of his birth, he would have to go. And this, he was sure, would give her much more pride than if he were to stay at home. On the same day, August 13th, that this note was sent, word came to Washington that he had been made chief of all troops in Virginia, and the next month he went to Winchester to stay. Here he found much to do. There was need of more troops, and it was hard work to get them. Forts had to be built, and he drew up a plan of his own and set his men to work it out, and went out from time to see how they got on with it. He rode off thus at the risk of his life, for red men lay in wait for scalps and were fierce to do deeds of blood. The stir of war put new life into the veins of old Lord Fairfax. He got up a troop of horse and put them through a drill on the lawn at Greenway Court. He was fond of the chase, and knew how to run the sly fox to the ground. The red man was a sort of fox, and Fairfax was keen for the chase, and now and then would mount his steed and call on George Washington, who was glad to have his kind friend so near. In a short time he had need of his aid, for word came from the fort at Will's Creek that a band of red men were on the warpath with firebrands and knives, and were then on their way to Winchester. A man on a fleet horse was sent post-haste to Washington, who had been called to Williamsburg, the chief town. In the meantime, Lord Fairfax sent word to all the troops near his home to arm and haste to the aid of Winchester. Those on farms flocked to the towns, where they thought they would be safe, and the townfolk fled to the west side of the Blue Ridge. In the height of this stir, Washington rode into town, and the sight of him did much to quell their fears. He thought that there were but a few redskins who had caused this great scare, and it was his wish to take the field at once and go out and put them to flight. But he could get but a few men to go with him. The rest of the town's troops would not stir. All the old firearms that were in the place were brought out, and smiths set to work to scour off the rust and make them fit for use. Caps, such as are now used on guns, were not known in those days. Flintstones took their place. One of these was put into the lock, so that when it struck a piece of steel, it would flash fire, and the spark would set off the gun. These were called flintlock guns. Such a thing as a match had not been thought of, and flintstones were made use of to light all fires. Carts were sent off for balls and flints, and for food with which to feed all those who had flocked to Winchester. The tribes of red men that had once served with Washington were now on good terms with the French. One of their chiefs, named Jacob, laughed at forts that were built of wood, and made his boast that no fort was safe from him if it would catch fire. The town where these red men dwelt was 20 miles from Fort Duquesne, and a band of brave white men, with George Armstrong and Hugh Mercer at their head, set out from Winchester to put them to rout. At the end of a long march, they came at night on the red men's stronghold and took them off their guard. The red men, led by the fierce chief Jacob, who chose to die ere he would yield, made a strong fight. But in the end, most of them were killed, their huts were set on fire, and the brave stronghold was a stronghold no more. In the meantime, Washington had left Winchester and gone to Fort Cumberland on Wills Creek. Here he kept his men at work on the new roads and old ones. Some were sent out as scouts. Brigadier General Forbes, who was in charge of the whole force, was on his way from Philadelphia, but his march was a slow one, as he was not in good health. The plan was when he came to move on the French fort. The work that was to have been done north of the fort by Lord Loudoun hung fire. It was felt that he was not the right man for the place, and so his lordship was sent back to England. Major General Abercrombie then took charge of the king's troops at the north. These were to charge on Crown Point. Major General Amherst, with a large force of men, was with the fleet of Admiral Boscawen that set sail from Halifax the last of May. These were to lay siege to Louisbourg and the Isle of Cape Breton, which is at the mouth of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Forbes was to move on Fort Duquesne, and was much too slow to suit Washington, who was in haste to start. His men had worn out their old clothes and were in great need of new ones, which they could not get for some time. He liked the dress the Redmen wore. It was light and cool, and what had to be thought of most, it was cheap. Washington had some of his men put on this dress, and it took well, and has since been worn by those who roam the woods and plains of our great land. I will not tell you of all that took place near the Great Lakes at this time, as I wish to keep your mind on George Washington. The schemes laid out by General Forbes did not please Washington, who urged a prompt march on the fort while the roads were good. He wrote to Major Halkett, who had been with Braddock and was now on Forbes's staff. I find him fixed to lead a new way to the Ohio, through a road each inch of which must be cut where we have scarce time left to tread the old track, which is known by all to be the best path through the hills. He made it plain that if they went that new way, all would be lost, and they would be waylaid by the redskins and meet with all sorts of ills. But no heed was paid to his words, and the warm days came to an end. 6 weeks were spent in hard work on the new road, with a gain of less than 60 miles, when the whole force might have been in front of the French fort had they marched by the old road as Washington had urged. At a place known as Loyal Hannon, the troops were brought to a halt, as Forbes thought this was a good place to build a fort. Some men in charge of Major Grant went forth as scouts. At dusk, they drew near a fort, and set fire to a log house near its walls. This was a rash thing to do, as it let the French know just where they were. But not a gun was fired from the fort. This the king's troops took for a sign of fear, and were bold and proud and quite sure that they would win the day. So Braddock had thought, and we know his fate. At length, when Forbes and his men were off their guard, the French made a dash from the fort, and poured their fire on the king's troops. On their right and left flanks fell a storm of shot from the redskins, who had hid back of trees, rocks, and shrubs. The king's troops were then brought up in line, and for a while stood firm and fought for their lives. But they were no match for the redskins, whose fierce yells made the blood run chill. Major Lewis fought hand to hand with a brave, whom he laid dead at his feet. Redskins came up at once to take the white man's scalp, and there was but one way in which he could save his life. This was to give himself up to the French, which both he and Major Grant were forced to do, as their troops had been put to rout with a great loss. Washington won much praise for the way in which the Virginia troops had fought, and he was once put in charge of a large force, who were to lead the van, serve as scouts, and do their best to drive back the redskins, work that called for the best skill and nerve. It was late in the fall of the year when the king's troops all met Loyal Hannon, and so much had to be done to clear the roads that snow would be on the ground ere they could reach the fort. But from those of the French they had seized in the late fight, they found out that there were but a few troops in the fort, that food was scarce, and the redskins false to their trust. This led hope to the king's troops, who made up their minds to push on. They took up their march at once, with no tents or stores, and but few large guns. Washington rode at the head. It was a sad march, for the ground was strewn with the bones of those who had fought with Grant and with Braddock, and had been slain by the foe or died of their wounds. At length the troops drew near the fort, and made their way up to it with great care, for they thought the French would be in wait for them. and that there would be a fierce fight. But the French had had such bad luck in Canada that they had lost heart, and those in the fort were left to take care of themselves. So when the English were one day's march from the fort, the French stole out at night, got into boats, set the fort on fire, and went down the Ohio by the light of the flames. So the fort, which had been the cause of so much bloodshed, fell at last without a blow. And on November 25th, 1758, Washington, with his vanguard, marched in and placed the British flag on the wreck of the once proud stronghold, the name of which was changed to Fort Pitt. The French gave up all claim to the Ohio from that time. The Redskins were quick to make friends with those who held sway, and there was peace, with all but the tribes twixt the Ohio and the lakes. Washington had made up his mind to leave the field when this war came to an end, and in December of that same year he bade his troops goodbye. He had been with them for 5 years in a hard school, and the strain on his mind had been so great that he lost his health and felt that he could war no more. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 7. The Home of Washington. In the year 1758, while Washington was with his troops at Winchester, he met and fell in love with Mrs. Martha Custis. Her home was known as the White House, and here she dwelt in fine style, for she had great wealth. She had a boy 6 years of age and a girl of 4. Such were her charms that men of wealth and rank sought for her hand. But Washington, so calm and grave, and with his way yet to make in the world, won her heart, and they were to be wed at the close of the war. She had heard of the brave deeds he had done, and was proud to be the wife of such a man. So on January 6, 1759, the two were made one. In the course of a few months, Washington went to live at Mount Vernon, where he spent much of his time in the care of his own lands and those of his wife. He had a seat with those who made laws for the state, and no man was thought more of than George Washington. Washington loved to be at Mount Vernon, where he had spent a great part of his boyhood with his brother Lawrence, of whom he was so fond. The house stood on a knoll, and near it were wild woods and deep dells, haunts of the fox and the deer, and bright streams where fish could be found at all times. His chief sport was the chase, and at the right time of the year, he would go out 2 or 3 times a week with dogs and horns and trained steeds in search of the sly fox who would lead him and his friends a fine run. Sometimes he would go out with his gun and shoot wild ducks, great flocks of which might be found on the streams close at hand. Or he would scour the woods for the game with which they were filled, and which none of those who owned the place had a right to kill. A man who had a bad name and paid no heed to the laws that were made was wont to make his way to the grounds near Mount Vernon and shoot just what game he chose. More than once he had to be told to leave and not come back, but he paid no more heed than if he had been deaf, and was sure to take his pick from the best kind of ducks. One day when Washington was out on horseback, he heard the sound of a gun down near the edge of the stream. He put spurs to his horse, dashed through brush and brake, and soon came up to the rogue, who had just time to jump in his boat and push from shore. Then the bad man raised his gun, cocked it, and took aim at Washington, whom he would no doubt have shot down in cold blood. But Washington rode at once into the stream and seized the prow of the boat and drew it to shore. Then he sprang from his horse, wrenched the gun from the thief's hand, and laid on the lash in such a way that the rogue took to his heels when let loose, and came no more to Mount Vernon. As I told you, men of great wealth dwelt on the shores of the Potomac, and kept house in fine style. They had a large force of slaves, and made great feasts for their friends. One of them used to come out in a rich barge to meet Washington. This barge was rowed by 6 black men in check shirts and black velvet caps. Washington had a coach and 4, with black footmen for Mrs. Washington to use when she drove out, but he chose to go on horseback. Sometimes he and his wife went to Annapolis, to a ball or feast of some sort. where Washington took part in the dance, and all the belles of the day were proud to dance with him, for he had a grand style that made him seem like no one else in the room. When storms kept him in the house, he would read or spend time at his desk with pen in hand. He was kind to his slaves and took the best care of them when they were sick, but was quick to see that they did not shirk their work. He knew, too, just the kind of work each one was fit for, and which he could do the best. 4 of his slaves set out to hew and shape a large log. Washington kept his eye on them and thought they loafed too much. So he sat down, took out his watch, and timed them. How long it took them to get their cross-cut saw and the rest of their tools, how long to cut off the limbs of the tree they had laid low, how long to hew and saw it, what time they spent in talk, and how much work they did while he sat there and took notes. In this way, he found out just how much work 4 men could do in the course of a day and take their ease. Washington was quick to lend a hand in time of need, and once when word was brought him that the dam had broke loose and the mill would soon be swept off, he ran at the head of all his slaves and workmen and toiled as hard as they in a fierce rainstorm to check the force of the flood. The cares of home and state made such calls on his time and thoughts that he could not be said to live quite at his ease, and he left his mark, a high one, on all that he did. His crops were of the best, and he sought to cheat no one. The flour he sold from year to year was put up with so much care, and was of such good kind, and so true in weight, that all that bore the name George Washington Mount Vernon was held at a high rate in the West India ports. Quite a trade was kept up with Europe, where all the goods had to be bought that were used in the house or on the farm. Twice a year Washington sent a long list of such things as he had need of: plows, hoes, scythes, horse goods, and clothes for all the household. For these last he had to give size and height, name and age of those who were to wear them. In one of these lists, Washington, who had need of a new suit of clothes, said he was 6 feet in height, quite thin, and had long limbs. He was then 31 years old. You will see by what I have told you just how Washington spent much of his time for at least 5 years. They were 5 sweet years to him, full of peace and rest and joy. He was fond of his home, and felt as much pride in Nellie and John Parke Custis as if they had been his own boy and girl. Nellie was a frail child, and did not gain in strength, though she had the best of care. Her death took place on June 19, 1773, when she was but 17 years of age. This was a sad blow to Washington, as well as to his wife. And then all their hopes were placed on the son, who bade fair to be a fine, strong man. But he died in the year 1781 at the age of 28. While Washington dwelt in peace at Mount Vernon, war was rife in the land. But as he had withdrawn from those who bore arms, he took no part in it. It was called Pontiac's War, as it was led by a chief of that name. But the Ohio tribes were with him, and the plot was deep laid. Large tracts of woodland were laid waste, homes were burnt, and those who dwelt in them robbed and slain. And so sly and shrewd were the redskins that it was some time ere the white men could put a stop to their deeds of blood. It was in 1760 that King George III made up his mind to tax the folks in America for all the goods they bought in England. The trade was large, and in this way the king could add much to his wealth. But the scheme did not work well. It was first tried in Boston, and set all the folks there by the ears. They claimed that they had the rights as well as the king. They had come to this land to be free, and free they would be. They would do without tea and such things, and dress as well as they could in clothes made out of homemade goods. The king next said that goods bought from England must bear the king's stamp, for which a sum was to be paid more than the cost of the goods. This was known as the Stamp Act. The folks in America were poor. They had not the means to pay this tax. The thought of it filled them with rage, and for 5 years there was much talk of the wrong the king had done to those who dwelt in America. On the first day of November 1765, the Stamp Act was to go into force, and all New England was in arms. At Boston, bells were tolled, flags were hung at half-mast, shops were shut, and bonfires built. In New York, the act, in clear print, was borne through the streets on a pole, on top of which was a death's head. a man named Calden, whose place it was to serve out the stamps, had to flee to the fort, round which was placed a strong guard from a ship of war. The mob broke into his coach house, drew out his coach, put in it a form, stuffed and dressed to look somewhat like Calden, and marched up to the park, where they hung it on a tree. At night they took the form down, put it in a coach, and bore it back to Bowling Green, where the whole thing, coach and all, was burnt right in range of the guns of the fort where the king's troops were. In March 1766, the king drew back the Stamp Act, which gave great joy to those who had the good of America at heart, and to none more than to George Washington. But he made it known that he felt it to be his right, as their king, to tax them as he chose. And this hurt the pride of those who wished to make their own laws and be in bonds to no one. Washington, as did most of those who had English blood in their veins, looked upon that land as his home, and was loath to break the chain that bound him to it. But he did not think well of the Stamp Act, and saw what was sure to come to pass if the king pressed too hard on the Americans. On September 5th, 1774, a band of true men from all the states met for the first time in Philadelphia, and Washington set out from Mount Vernon on horseback to take his seat with them. With him were Patrick Henry and Edmund Pendleton, and as they rode side by side they talked of the land they loved, and of the hopes they had that all would be well. The band met with closed doors. Each man wore a grave face. Patrick Henry made a strong speech, at the close of which he said, "All America is thrown into one mass. Where are your landmarks? They are all thrown down." He said he did not call himself by the name of the state in which he was born, but by the name of the land which gave him birth, then known as the land of the free. Washington was not a man of words, but of deeds. But what he said was of great weight, as it came from a wise brain and a true heart. Patrick Henry said there was no man in the whole band so great as George Washington. The band broke up in November, and Washington went back to Mount Vernon, but not to the gay times and good cheer he once had known. George Fairfax, who had been his friend from boyhood, had gone to England to live, and Belvoir took fire one night and was burnt to the ground. The stir in Boston and in the West, where the Redskins were on the warpath, made the whole land ill at ease. Troops were kept on drill, and the roll of the drum was heard in all the small towns. Men came to talk with Washington, and to find out what he thought was the best thing to do, and the best ways to drill or to arm troops. It was of no use to plead with the king. He had made up his mind and would not yield an inch. A large force of the best men in Virginia met at Richmond, March 20th, 1775, and Washington was called on for some plan as to what their course should be. He told them that he thought there was but one thing to do. Patrick Henry put it into words that rang through the land. "We must fight. I repeat it, sir. We must fight. An appeal to arms, and the God of hosts is all that is left us." All hearts were full of zeal, and Washington wrote to his brother Augustine that if there was need of it, he would lead the troops to war and risk his life and all his wealth in the cause, which seemed to him a most just one. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 8. The Battle of Bunker Hill. In the year 1775, war was rife in New England. The king's laws were felt to be more for slaves than for freemen, and all made up their minds to throw off the yoke. They could not bear the sight of the redcoats, and the king's troops were just as fierce in their hate of our men. Ships of war brought a large force of troops to New England, led by men of rank and fame. They filled the streets of Boston, and it was thought that they might bring the Americans to terms, and not a drop of blood be shed. But this was not to be. A large force of our men were in camp on the hills and fields near Boston, the sight of whom might well cause the well-clad British to smile. They had left their farms in great haste at the cry of "To arms!" had seized their guns and come in homespun clothes it was their pride to wear. Those from Massachusetts were led by General Artemus Ward, those from New Hampshire by Colonel John Stark, those from Rhode Island by General Nathaniel Greene, and those from Connecticut by General Israel Putnam, all brave and true men and full of fight. But the troops had need to be well armed, and all the guns and such things as there was need of in times of war were in Boston, where the redcoats were on guard. But those sharp eyes were on the watch. Sly deeds were done by those who knew the ways in and out of each storehouse. Carts went out of town heaped high with dirt, in which guns and balls were hid, and all sorts of tricks were used to get such things past the redcoats. At length it came to the ears of General Gage that some field guns were at Salem, and he sent troops to seize them. But when they reached Salem, they found no guns there. The word came to General Gage that there was a large stock of arms and war stores at Concord, which was less than a score of miles from Boston. In the night of April 18th, the redcoats set out for Concord. General Gage had said that no one but the troops should leave the town. But the news was borne to Lexington, a town on the road to Concord, by those who were as swift as the hare and sly as the fox. The folks there met in groups, with hearts on fire. Bells were rung and guns were fired. Men who heard these sounds ran as fast as they could to Lexington to hold the bridge and keep back the foe. At 5 o'clock on the morn of April 19th, the redcoats came in sight, and at once 70 men stood out on the green near the wall to meet them. Major Pitcairn, who was at the head of the king's troops, called out to these brave men to lay down their arms and leave the place, but they paid no heed to his words. Then he sprang from the ranks, shot off a small gun, swung his sword in the air, and told his men to fire. The troops ran up with loud cheers and poured a storm of shot on our men, some of whom were killed. Then they pushed on to Concord and did all the harm they could at that place, spiked guns, threw pounds and pounds of shot down the wells, and spoiled a large lot of the flour and food that had been stored for use in time of need. When the king's troops turned back to Lexington, they were quite worn out with what they had done, and would have been cut down by our men if Gage had not sent a force to their aid. For the bluecoats had flown to arms and poured into Lexington by all the roads that led thereto. The redcoats might laugh at their clothes and the way in which they tried to keep step, but they found out that they knew how to use guns, and that each man was a dead shot. The fresh troops Gage sent up from Boston had to form a square, so that the worn-out men who had had a long march and hard work might have a chance to rest. Then they all set out to march back to Boston, with 2 field guns in the rear to keep off the flock of Yankees, who dogged their steps and kept up a fire in front and rear, and from each stone wall and hedge that lined the road. There was loss on both sides, but what hurt the king's troops the most was to be put to flight by such a lot of scarecrows as they thought our troops were. A close watch was kept on Boston by our men, who were soon in such force that it would not have been safe for the redcoats to try to leave the town. The king's troops did not like to be shut in this way, and lost no chance to mock at and taunt those who kept them at bay. On the north side of Boston lay a long strip of land, from the heights of which one could see the town and all the ships at or near the wharves. Putnam thought it would be a good plan to seize these heights and place troops there, but Ward and Warner thought it was not safe to risk it. It might bring on a fierce fight and cause much blood to be shed. Putnam had no fear of his own men. He knew how brave they were, and how well they could fight back of a screen. They had no fear of their heads, he said. Their chief thought is their legs. Shield them, and they'll fight on till doomsday. 2 or 3 of those who had led troops in the French war were of the same mind as Putnam, and their words had weight. The chief man was Colonel Prescott, who was just the style of man in port and in dress that a lot of raw troops would look up to. He wore a fine hat, a top wig, and a blue coat faced and lapped up at the skirts. He it was whom General Ward chose to lead the troops which were to seize the heights, build the earthworks there, and guard them from the foe. There were 1,200 in all, and they set out on the night of June 16, 1775. Not a light was shown, not a sound was heard, but the tramp, tramp, tramp of these men on their way to face death. A small neck of land joined Charleston to the mainland, and as they drew near this, the troops hushed their steps and moved with great care. For on this the redcoats kept a close watch. 5 of their ships of war stood so that their guns would sweep this neck of land, and earthworks were on Copp's Hill, which faced Charleston. On the bluecoats went, past the guards, past the guns, past the neck, and up to the heights of Bunker's Hill. Here they were to make their stand, but it was found that Breed's Hill, which was half a mile off, was not quite so steep, and would give them more of a chance at the redcoats, while Bunker's Hill would shield them in the rear. Putnam thought Breed's Hill was the right place, and was in haste from the work to go on. There was no time to lose, so pick and spade were brought out, and the earth dug out so as to serve as a wall to screen them from the fire of the foe. The night was warm and still. Now and then Prescott would steal down to the edge of the stream to see and hear if the redcoats had made a stir. There was not a sound save the cry of all's well, from the watchmen on guard in the town and on the ships of war. All night the work on the heights went on. At dawn of day, the men there were seen by the seamen on the ships of war, and at once their guns were brought up and turned on the hill. Their shot did not harm the works, but one man who went outside was killed, and this threw the rest into a great fright. They were not used to scenes of war, and the sight of a man shot down in their midst was more than their nerves could stand. Some took to their heels at once and did not come back, and had Prescott not been a brave man himself, he could not have held his troops as he did. He stood up on top of the earthworks in full view of the redcoats and talked with his men, and his words of cheer put new strength in their hearts, so that they were in less dread of the balls that whizzed near them. The noise of the guns roused the redcoats in Boston, and General Gage gazed at Breed's Hill like one in a dream. A fort full of men had sprung up in the night. How had it been done? What kind of men were these he had to meet? As he stood on Copp's Hill and looked through his field glass, he spied the tall form of Prescott in his blue coat on the wall of the fort. "Will he fight?" asked Gage. "Yes, sir," said one who stood near and who knew Prescott. "He will fight to the last drop of blood, but I can't say as much for his men." "We must seize the works," cried Gage, and at once called up his chiefs for a talk and to plan the best way to do this deed. The noise in the streets of Boston, the roll of the drum, the sound of the trump that calls to war, the sharp clicks of hooves, and the deep roll of wheels that bore the field guns were heard on the heights, and let the troops there to know the war was at hand. The men were worn out with their hard task and their loss of sleep. They had not brought much food with them, and their thirst was great. The heat made them feel weak and dull. There was need of more men, and a lot of raw New Hampshire troops led by Colonel Stark came to their aid. In the meantime, those on the height had to bear the fire of the guns from the ships and from Copp's Hill, which broke on them at 10 o'clock. At noon, the bluecoats saw more than a score of boats full of troops cross from Boston in straight lines. The sun shone on their red coats and flashed from the tips of the guns they bore, and from the brass field guns that stood on the deck. It was a gay scene. They made their way to a point north of Breed's Hill, where General Howe, who led them, could see the full strength of the bluecoats. They had more troops than he thought, and he caught sight of fresh ones on their way to Breed's Hill. Howe at once sent to Gage for more troops and more balls for the field guns. And as it would take some time for them to be sent round, the redcoats in the meantime were served with food and drink. The grog was passed round in pails, and the men sat round on the grass and ate and drank their fill, while the poor men on the heights looked down and longed to share their feast. But while the redcoats took their ease, the bluecoats had a chance to add to the strength of their fort and to push out the breastworks to a point known as the Slough. Near this was a pass where the foe might turn the left flank of the troops or seize Bunker's Hill. Putnam chose one of his men, a Captain Knowlton, to hold this pass with his Connecticut troops. He at once set to work to build a sort of fort, back of which his men could fight with more ease than if they stood out in the field. Not a long way off was the post and rail fence set in a low footwall of stone, and this fence ran down to the Mystic River. The posts and rails of the fence near this were torn up in haste and set a few feet at the rear of it, and the space twixt the two was filled with new-mown hay brought from the fields near at hand. While Knowlton and his men were at work on the fence, Putnam and his troops threw up the work on Bunker's Hill. In the meantime, Stark had set out from Medford on a 6-mile march. He was a cool, calm man, and had been through the French War, of which I have told you. He led his men at a slow pace, so that they would be fresh and strong to take part in the fight. As they came up to the neck, which they had to cross, and which was lined with guns on both sides, one of the aides urged him to let the men take a quick step. The old man shook his head and said, "One fresh man in a fight is worth 10 tired ones," and kept on at the same pace, and did good work that day back of the post and rail screen. Warren, who had been made a major general, came to serve in the ranks. Putnam said he might lead the troops at the fence. He said he did not care to lead. He was there to fight. Where will the fire be the hottest, he asked. He was told that the fort on Breed's Hill was the point the foe sought to gain. "If we can hold that," said Putnam, "the day is ours." Warren at once made his way there, and the troops gave a round of cheers when he stepped into the fort. Prescott, who was not so high in rank, sought to have Warren take charge of the troops, but he would not. "I have come to serve in the ranks," he said, "and shall be glad to learn from one so well skilled as yourself." The redcoats thought to take the works with ease and win the day. General Piggott, with the left wing, was to mount the hill and seize the earthworks, while General Howe came up with the right wing to turn the left flank of our men and stop all flight at the rear. Piggott and his men came up to the height, and not a gun was fired by our troops till the redcoats were in range. Then, as they were all good marksmen, each shot told, and some of the best men fell at the first fire. The foe fell back in haste, but were brought up once more by those who stood at their head with drawn swords. They were met by a fire more fierce than the first, and vexed by guns that bore on their flank from the band of men in Charleston. So much blood had been shed, and the men were in such a state of fright that Piggott was forced to give the word to fall back. We will now see what sort of luck General Howe had. He led his troops up the bank of the stream, and thought to take the slight breastwork with ease, and so get in the rear of the fort. But he did not know the ground, and could not bring his large guns through the swamp he met with. In the pause, some of his men were hurt, and some killed by the guns that were set by the post and rail fence. Howe's men kept up a fire as they came on, but as they did not take good aim, the balls flew o'er the heads of our troops, who had been told to hold their fire till the redcoats were quite near. Some few did not do as they were told, and Putnam rode up and swore he would cut down the next man that fired, ere he had the word to do so. When the redcoats were in the right range, such a storm of lead poured on them from guns in the hands of men who did not miss a mark that the place was like a field of blood. Such a host were slain that the redcoats lost heart and fell back in great haste. Some of them ran back as far as the boats and got on board of them, that they might be safe from the fire of the marksmen. Once more the redcoats charged the fort, which it was their aim to get into their own hands. In the meantime, the shells from Copp's Hill and the ships of war had set Charleston on fire. The town was built of wood, and was soon a mass of flames. The dense smoke put out the light of the sun. On all sides was heard the din of war. The big guns kept up their great roar. Bombshells burst in the air. The sharp hiss of the small balls and the shouts and yells of the men made a scene to strike the heart with awe. Our men stood firm, and, with the eyes fixed on the foe, who, as soon as they were close at hand, were shot down by the guns whose aim was so sure. The redcoats stood the first shock, and then kept on, but they were met by such a stream of fire that they were soon brought to a halt. In vain did the men who led them urge them on with drawn swords. Whole ranks were mowed down. Some of General Howe's staff were slain, and the troops, wild with fear, broke ranks and fled down the hill. For a third time General Howe brought up his men, some of whom threw off their knapsacks and some their coats, that they may not be weighed down by them. The redcoats made a feint, as if they would take the fort at the fence, and did much harm there to our men. While some of his troops were at work at the point, Howe brought the rest of his force to the front and rear of the main fort, which was then stormed on 3 sides at once. Prescott told some of his men to stand at the back part of the fort and fire at the redcoats that showed themselves on the wall. Soon one leaped up and cried, "The day is ours," and was shot down at once, as were all those who had joined him. But our men had fired their last round, and there was naught for them to do but meet the foe in a hand-to-hand fight. With stones and the butt ends of their guns, they sought to drive back the redcoats, but the tide was too strong for them, and they had to give way. Warren, who had done brave work that day, was the last to leave the fort. He scarce had done so ere he was struck by a ball and fell dead on the spot. As our troops fled by way of Bunker Hill, Putnam ran to the rear and cried, "Halt! Make a stand here! We can check them yet! In God's name, form, and give them one shot more!" But the troops could not be brought to a stand, and the Redcoats won the day, but with loss of more than half their men, and it hurt their pride to think that it cost them so dear to take these earthworks that had been thrown up in one night by a mere handful of raw troops. Their loss was 1,054. Our loss was 450. End of chapter 8.